Hi everyone, my name is Gabriel and this is the Hour of the Raven, your channel for everything Ravenloft, RPG, Dungeons and Dragons, and horror. Today we are taking a little break from our explorations of the Lands of the Mists to review the two volumes of the Van Richten's Encyclopedia of Dark Lords and Domains, released by Mist Factor Press at DM's Guild. Before we begin, however, I would like to make a few preliminary remarks. For this video review, I have previously received 2 digital copies of the books. Aside from the digital copies sent, I would like to inform that this review is in no way sponsored by the publishers or authors of the product. To better analyze the content of the books, I will divide the analysis into the following topics. What is the Van Richten's Encyclopedia of Dark Lords and Domains? The Van Richten Encyclopedia of Dark Lords and Domains is a book published by Mist Factor Press, a group composed of enthusiasts and fans of the Ravenloft campaign setting that publishes products for the Ravenloft campaign setting on DM's Guild. The books are intended to be a compilation of all the domains and Dark Lords that have ever existed for the Ravenloft campaign setting prior to the Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft reboot, and present domains from all editions of Dungeons & Dragons, including elements of the version of Barovia featured for the Curse of Strahd adventure. The books also feature tokens and stats for all Dark Lords, and adapt elements such as spells, creatures, and items from the classic setting to the 5th edition, promoting a true adaptation and transition from the classic material to the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Each volume has nearly 400 pages, and both books reach almost 800 pages of material, and are available on DM's Guild on its physical and digital version. Although the photographs of the physical books look amazing, and seem to look good in any shelf or collection, the present review considers only the books in digital format, which I had access for the present analysis. Who is this book for? The books of Van Richten's Encyclopedia of Dark Lords and Domains are, for the most part, a faithful adaptation of the classic Ravenloft setting for the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons. To faithfully fulfill this task, the books lean into gothic horror and dark themes, and does not shy away from tackling some macabre and disturbed topics that were present in previous editions of the setting. Unlike the new Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft, which adopts a dark fantasy tone with only touches of horror, this book aimed to rescue the gothic horror presented in previous products of the setting. At the beginning of the books, there is a warning of potentially disturbing content that informs that the subjects dealt within these tomes, although treated with care and respect, can be cause of discomfort at some tables, and that their use should be the subject of debate between dungeon master and players. Due to the dark topics covered in the volumes, these books are not intended for children, and I believe that it will be best enjoyed by dungeon masters and players who already have some maturity or familiarity with horror themes. Considering the content of the books, presenting in detail the domain and their respective Dark Lords, I understand that these books are intended primarily for dungeon masters. The book does not introduce new classes and character creation options, and players who intend to experience the horrors of the classic Ravenloft setting will have a better experience uncovering these horrors directly in their adventures, without spoilers. Despite this, the content presented in each of the domains can also be an important tool for creating characters that are native to the Land of the Mists, and that are integrated into the themes and domains from which they came. Finally, it should be noted that this book is not dedicated to adapting any element of the new Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft. That doesn't mean, however, that this book can't be an excellent way to introduce the classic Ravenloft setting to new explorers of the Mists. At no point is this book intended to antagonize fans and authors of the new Ravenloft setting presented by the Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft. On its opening lines, its authors propose their view of the cosmology of the Demiplane of Dread, explaining that the Mists do not contain just one version of Ravenloft, but countless ones, and that it can contain several different versions of their domains and Dark Lords, making it unnecessary to choose between different versions. So, in my view, this is a book for mature readers, especially for dungeon masters who want to discover and create adventures set in the classic Ravenloft setting, but it can also serve as a gateway to players, both new and old, who want to explore the Mists in search of the origins and mysteries of the Ravenloft setting from past editions. Presentation and art direction. The 2 volumes of the Van Richten Encyclopedia are diagrammed and presented with elements that immediately evoke the darker Gothic tone of the classic Ravenloft setting. In stark contrast to the Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft, this book strays from the heroic fantasy of the 5th edition and the vibrant pastel tones that can often be seen in products of the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. The layout of the pages is done in dark and grey tones that emulate a frame made by the Mists and evoke the darker tones of the setting. In addition to the border of the pages, there are elements that immediately refer to the formatting of books in older editions of Ravenloft products, such as red borders for text and citation highlights that open each domain and Dark Lord passages. The books seek to rescue the visual identity of the old line of products of the setting and succeed in evoking the Gothic atmosphere and the nostalgia of old fans. Personally, I quite like the style adopted, although it can sometimes be tiring for the eyes of the reader, especially considering the long paragraphs and text blocks contained in these massive volumes. The book's art direction also seeks to bring back the aesthetics of the products of the classic setting, bringing evocative and disturbing art, whether in black and white or in color. I really like the cover art for both books. The one in the first volume depicts the gates of some mansion in ruins, with a sinister figure in cape watching everything from above. The cover of the second volume depicts a carriage arriving at an imposing and somber castle, which reminds me a lot of Castle Ravenloft. Considering that Barovia is covered in the first volume, I would have switched the covers between them. But regardless, both artworks are quite beautiful and evocative. As for the interior arts, it is necessary to praise the efforts of the creators to fill the book with arts from different sources and authors, without it seeming out of tune with each other and with the general tone of the book. In conversation with the lead designer, he revealed to me that the book was constructed with a mix of artwork that was commissioned for the book, artwork that was copyright free, artwork acquired from online stock images, and artwork offered voluntarily by project supporters. The result is satisfactory, but there are different levels of quality in the art of the books. Although there are books in the DM's Guild with greater investment in artwork, in general terms the books are very beautiful and faithful in its proposal to emulate the aesthetic of old products of the setting. Each new domain introduced is preceded by an art in full page and color that relates to the main theme to be explored in the domain. Throughout the book, the artwork varies in style, although some colored artwork also adorns the book, bringing a contrast to its more grey and somber tone. Each of the Dark Lords featured also gets a framed portrait, just like the ones featured in the book Domains of Dread, and on the 3rd edition Ravenloft Gazetteers, which once again evokes the nostalgia of old fans of the setting. These artworks of the Dark Lords come from different artists and vary greatly in style and quality. Some of them use old photographs, others use paintings or drawings, and some are custom made for the book. Among my favorites are Captain Nathan Timothy, Ivan Delisnia, Ladslav Misea, Elena Faithhold, Anton Missouri, and Sir Torrance Bladesmith. Some, however, although faithful to the description of the characters, fail to convey the dark aura and weight of these characters. A few Dark Lords are not given a portrait. This is the case with Isolde from Carnival and Dr. Victor Mordenheim from Lamordia. Finally, still in the art departments are the maps presented in both books. The Volume 1 opens with a beautiful map of the core of Ravenloft, and each domain also features individualized maps. The highlight in the maps of Volume 1 are the map of Agarat, a domain in different facets of a jewel, and the beautiful maps of the House of Lament. As for the other maps presented in the domains in the Volume 1, unfortunately they do not have the same quality of the previously mentioned maps, and some only show the basic contours of the domain and a few details of the geography. It would be interesting to see on the map of Barovia, for example, the numerous new locations and cities presented by the book. The second volume presents maps from different sources, which are generally clearer and more detailed than those presented in the first volume. Although there is considerable variation in style, these maps are beautiful and easier to read and understand. Overall, the book presentation and art direction surprised me positively and remains consistent in terms of tone and proposal of the material. Content. The Van Richten's Encyclopedia to Dark Lords and Domains fulfilled their purpose to present a massive content, presenting in the 2 volumes all the domains and Dark Lords that were published in any official source of the setting. The first volume is dedicated to the domains contained in the core of the setting, and covers all domains of the continent, as well as those of the Sea of Sorrows and the Nocturnal Sea. In addition, they also present wandering domains that constantly change locations. The second volume features domains contained in clusters and islands of terror, in addition to the Nightmare Lands, the domains of the Gothic Earth, and the domains featured during the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Both books also feature a final appendix, where monsters, NPCs, items, and spells are presented, all adapted for the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. We must praise the efforts of the creators of this material to compile and present information on all the domains and Dark Lords of the Ravenloft setting, from the beginnings of the setting publication until the Curse of Strahd adventure, covering content of all editions of the game of Dungeons & Dragons. Some of the domains featured in this book, such as Kislova or the Mithras Court, only appeared in the setting novels, and others, such as the House of Strategy, appeared solely in an RPGA adventure, present by TSR at an RPG event, which highlights the impressive work of research and the completeness of the information presented. The books aren't content to present only Dark Lords and domains that existed in the current timeline of the classic setting, and domains already vanished or absorbed like Arkandale and Gundarak have chapters to describe them. The same care can be found with their Dark Lords, and even the obscure and deceased Bacolis, Camille Desliznia, and Claude Ronier receive a background, portrait, and stats adapted for the 5th edition. In terms of the volume of content, most domains receive more attention and detail that can be found, for example, in the 2nd edition Domains of Dread book, but less detail and information that you would find in a domain that have been covered in the Ravenloft Gazetteers. All domains receive a brief description of their purpose and themes, and suggestions on how to approach adventurers in this location. In sequence, we have a table with quick information and reference. followed by details of its fauna, flora, native horrors, and terrain. Finally, we receive a record of important landmarks and cities, as well as trivia about the domain. Understandably, for reasons of space and logistics, some detailed information about the history, economy and diplomatic relations, culture and society of each of the domains that were addressed by the Ravenloft Gazetteers is left out or treated only superficially. However, even if you already have extensive knowledge of the setting, there will be some new information presented in the books, as the material also brings a lot of additional locations and complementary content for the setting. Some domains receive new locations and additions created by the authors, which are presented in an integrated way with the rest of the content. Without doubt, the domain that receives most of these new additions is Barovia, which contains several new locations to be explored. Some cities, mentioned only in passing in one of the novels involving Strahd and Barovia, now have a brief description and even suggestions of mysteries and dark plots to be explored. The version of Strahd that we find in the Barovia chapter is the one that Mist Factor Press had previously presented in the product The Real Devil Strahd, and features a more challenging version of Count Strahd, with a challenge rating of 27 and much stronger stats. In addition to the content of domains and dark lords, the book also has appendices at the end of each book, which also feature new creatures, NPCs, items, and spells, all with stats for the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. This content is of great quality, and they are connected with the content presented in the chapters of Domains and Dark Lords. In these appendices, I missed some specific characters, like the tyrant Malokio Adere, who, although not a Dark Lord, currently ruled the domains of Invidia, or also the infamous Arcanoloth Inahira, who made a pact with Strahd before he became a vampire. Regarding the fidelity of the content to the classic setting, the vast majority of domains and Dark Lords are extremely faithful to the content presented in previous editions of the setting. However, there are situations where the authors took some liberties to alter the history of Dark Lords and domains. In the case of Lord Tristan Ablanc, for example, in the classic setting, only his mother escaped to the Druid Grove, with little Tristan still a baby in her arms, and gives him to the Druid's care before being executed. In the version presented in the books, Tristan arrives there with both his parents, and is already a 10-year-old boy, witnessing the execution of both his parents by the angry mob. In other cases, the authors made slight alterations and added information to the backstory of some Dark Lords, who previously lacked a detailed background. This is the case, for example, of Bloodspur, which was relocated in this book to the moon of the Land of the Mists, and the God Brain gains a new history, since previous edition did not detail his past. Most changes are minor alterations of the lore, and in some cases seems to me to be an effort to try to merge elements of the classic edition with parts of the cosmology and history presented in other editions of Dungeons & Dragons. This is the case of the witch Hadaga, for instance, whose background is adapted to encompass the fact that she was raised in a monastery dedicated to the Raven Queen, an entity that had not yet been introduced into the Dungeons & Dragons setting when Radaga was first presented. Perhaps the greatest example of this attempt to reconcile conflicting lore is the case of Barovia and Count Strahd. The book attempts to reconcile the classic setting with the version of the lore presented in Curse of Strahd, and features elements of both versions. In Strahd's background, for instance, he was approached by the entity called Death, with a dark pact, as in the classic setting. But then, Death only offers him the location of the Amber Temple, and there Strahd finds the entity known as Vampire, and makes with him a pact for immortality, as in the lore of Curse of Strahd. Connoisseurs of the classic setting may find some other points of contradiction between the classic setting and the Curse of Strahd lore, such as the fate of Strahd's parents, who were previously murdered by the Tags during the war, and now meet different deaths at the hand of other enemies. Although this differs a little from the proposal of straight fidelity to the classic setting presented in the description of other domains, it is understandable that an attempt is made to bring the book closer to the Curse of Strahd module, especially because this is such a successful adventure acclaimed by the public. Some of the new editions of Barovia are made with elements of the Curse of Strahd adventure and are highlights of the chapter. One of my favorites is the new version of the Umber Temple, that now has its mysteries related to the cult of Vecna. Finally, although it does not diminish in any way the final quality of the book, I identified some small inconsistencies in the text, probably the result of the treatment of the text by different authors, or a small problem in the book review process. This is the case, for example, of the Borca chapter, where initially it is said that Ivana Boritsi has her brother Suolo Boritsi as one of her main advisors, which is in accordance with the history of the classic setting. But later, when in the backstory of Camille de Slizia, the mother of Ivana, it is said that Ivana was her only child. Another example occurs in the Mordant chapter. When describing the murders committed by Lord Wilfred Godfroy, it is said that he blamed the death of his family on his favorite horse, which is in accordance with the history of the classic setting. But later, in the background of Lord Godfroy, it is said that he framed one of his servants for the crime. These minor discrepancies and incongruities, however, are certainly insignificant compared to the volume of content presented, and the two books in the Van Richten Encyclopedia of Dark Lords and Domains stand out for the quality of information they present to the readers. Final thoughts. The two books of the Van Richten Encyclopedia of Dark Lords and Domains update for the 5th edition the classic Ravenloft setting in all of its glory. More than a simple adaptation of rules and stats, these books have a high degree of fidelity to the classic content of the Ravenloft setting, whether in terms of their gothic tone and macabre content, or in terms of the history of their characters and domains. Concisely and neatly portraying all domains and Dark Lords released by official setting sources, from an adventure I6 Ravenloft in 1983 to Curse of Strahd released in 2016, these two volumes present themselves as a definitive source for knowing and researching the cursed Dark Lords and their prison in the mists. This project began more than 2 years ago by dedicated fans of the setting, who intended to end the hiatus of almost 15 years without an official product detailing the classic campaign setting. The arrival of the Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft midway to the course of this project, and its complete remake of the setting for the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, only reinforced the need for this book, to cater to fans who yearned to revisit the Land of the Mists in its original gothic horror strands. While not perfect, the books are a must-have for those looking to play the classic Ravenloft setting on the system of the 5th edition of D&D, and even for long-time players and dungeon masters, these books are valuable tools for knowing and researching the horrors of the mists. These books are the work of passionate fans of the setting, whose obsession with the mists has drawn them into this never-ending prison of gothic and dark adventures. They now extend this invitation to other explorers, so that they too may be lost in the mists of Ravenloft. Join us, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, and together we will continue our exploration through the mists of Ravenloft, and in the next episode we will begin our studies of ghosts.